I love how we have these vast empty spaces to explore and, that are still really as they always have been.
Welcome to Season 10, Episode 1 of the Backcountry Podcast. I'm Adam Howard. Today we're joined by photographer and backcountry contributor Jason Hummel. Jason grew up backcountry skiing on Washington's glaciers and in the surrounding wild country, including his first multi-day winter traverse of Mount Rainier at just 10 years old. Fast forward a few decades, and a lifetime of exploring Washington's wildest winter places has inspired Jason to become a student and avid researcher of Washington's glacial history. Along the way, he's documented his own epic multi-day and multi-year projects in the North Cascades. Before we go all in on glaciers with Jason, we'd like to thank Taos Ski Valley for sponsoring this episode and supporting independent media.
There's a place everyone has heard of, but few fully understand. A mountain destination that is committed to protecting its people, place, and planet so that its ecosystem and spirit can be preserved for generations to come. Taos Ski Valley is the world's first and only certified B Corporation ski resort and has earned 100% carbon neutral certification. While preserving their community and the planet is always at the forefront, at Taos, fun is never in the backseat. It is a place where families create cherished memories and groups of friends become family. Taos has the terrain to entertain any type of skier or boarder. Enjoy a winter vacation and feel good about choosing a mountain that values your values. Learn more at skitaos.com.
All right, friends, let's get into it. We hope you enjoy the new episode. Jason Hummel, welcome to the Backcountry Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'll typically do a fair amount of research before I interview someone. In your case, you've done so much photography work and writing for both backcountry and alpinist, it was pretty easy. I did, however, find myself in my inbox today, and I typed in your name because you never know what kind of correspondence we may or may not have had over the years. And there was an email from Mike Traslin in 2015 with a link to a video made by Jeff Rich. And it was about your Forbidden tour in the North Cascades?
Yeah, it was the Forbidden tour, correct, yes.
And so I got to watch that for the first time in 7 years. And what a treat it was to see, what we're talking about here, which is ski touring on glaciers in the North Cascades in your hometown. And I think the thing that struck me the most was the theme song, the song running through that video was, "This must be the place." And of course, the first word in that song by the Talking Heads is home. This is your home range. This is where you've really dedicated so much of your life to. What makes the place special beyond it just being home for you?
Well, anytime I go to a place, anywhere in the world, there's always somewhere special, somewhere that's amazing to me, and having grown up here in Washington, I find it special because I'd hate to say it, it is that home that I can come back to. And what makes it more meaningful is the history that I have here, my understanding of the history of the range itself, going back to the 1800s, and how I'm able to go to the top of one peak or another and look across the valley and have adventures that I've experienced in those places. And so it becomes more and more meaningful as time goes on, kind of like a fine wine, I guess. And those experiences have really enlarged, my understanding of the range and everything it means to me.
The stories that I hear and have read and we've published over the years about the North Cascades, one of the common refrains is the bushwhacking, the difficulty in getting into the heart of the range in certain places, maybe in all places. I've never been there, but I think, again, I get back to that video and I was thinking of the home range. I have a home range where it takes a lot of thrashing to get anywhere, but it makes it kind of unique in that the folks like yourself and the Scoogs and Andy Dappin and some of these guys that I've worked with over the years that know those ranges best, they're there on the best days. They can play the weather. It's not like they're flying into Seattle and then, just there for a week and hoping they get the weather. You guys are there. And yeah, you got to work these big tours you do around your lives, but there is like a home field advantage here. Let's be honest.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always that, part of that understanding of a range is figuring out those secret ways in and out of it, while not every way is a bushwhack in, sometimes to tie those places together, you're going ways that aren't necessarily the best. They're just kind of where you need to go. And, a lot of times when I'm trying to get to a very unusual place, I'm going there because of its lack of accessibility. And that experience for me, it's just made more interesting when I can not know anything about it and discover something, new for myself, that I haven't seen or heard of from anywhere else. And so those places generally are much more difficult to get into.
One of your big projects, and as I understand it, it's a lifelong project for the past 20 odd years. You've been working on this Washington Traverse project, which is where you're piecing together a north-south traverse through the range up into Canada, and you're taking chunks of it at a time. Tell us about that project. I know it's hard to kind of probably pinpoint a piece of it because we're talking about 20 different segments you've done over the years that you're calling part of this. And I know you've done many others as well, of course, but what was the drive? I mean, I guess it's because it's there, but like, that's a pretty massive undertaking. Tell us about why you're undertaking it.
For me, just, that was a project that really grew out of, beginning my first traverse when I must have been 9 or 10 years old. And I spent a week with, actually my little brother was 3.5 years younger. So he must have not been much older than 6. And my identical twin brother. And we traversed in middle of winter across the whole west side of Mount Rainier, taking a week to do it. And that was my first.
Know you were doing this?
Oh yeah, they went with us, of course. Although we did go off on our own quite often.
Oh man.
As I began to do more and more traverses, and Lowell Skoog and Carl Skoog absolutely were an inspiration later on for doing that, in commemoration of Carl Skoog. Once he had passed away in South America there, Lowell ended up putting together a traverse from Mount Baker all the way to Mount Rainier, and kind of tying together his memories and experiences with his brother. And I ended up finishing that a handful of years later after he had done it. And then I began to wonder if I could connect it together down to other traverses that I had done. And eventually I was just left with 2 parts, the very northern section and the very southern section where I actually grew up and learned to ski. And, it was not my biggest project. My biggest project is my Glacier project, but this project was just one on the side, nothing I really focused on per se, but given the conditions of last year, which were just horrific spring that we had, I just wanted to be able to do something that kind of made me feel like, as every year had done, that I was experiencing something new in the Cascades, and that always drives me to go out there. And so I wanted to, do that northern section and then do that southern section.
Jason, for our listeners that have never been to the North Cascades, what's it like? How would you describe that range to someone who's never been there or seen pictures of it?
What makes the Cascades unique, and especially the North Cascades, when you go to a place like Alaska, you have these massive peaks with these giant glaciated valleys that sometimes stretch 30, 40, 50 miles or more than that. And here in the Cascades, you can have an area that's maybe just 10 by 20 miles and yet spend years of your life exploring it because every corner is something new. Our range is very compact. In fact, I've heard say, and I've never verified this, that it's one of the most compact ranges for what's called their, the altitude basically goes from like 9,000 feet down to maybe even as low as 600 feet. And so you have a lot of vertical relief there. And because of that, and because of these very tight valleys and these very unique places, you're able to like go to every corner something new. And then on top of it, you go through these verdant forests up into these alpine slopes onto these glaciated sharp peaks, all within a handful of miles. You know, in the Olympic Peninsula, for instance, you go from the ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and then suddenly you're up on this peak called Mount Olympus with a glacier when it was measured in the 50s was 1,000 feet deep, you know, and it's south or nearly south of Seattle, you know, west of there. And to think that a glacier at 4,000 or 5,000 feet, you know, the height of many of our ski areas is 1,000 feet thick comes as a shock. But going back to the North Cascades, I think that package is what makes it unique, that you have to go through these forests and along these beautiful rivers into these, you know, alpine lakes, into these alpine glaciers. And that's what I love about it.
Yeah, and it really is alpine. I mean, Martin Volken, the Swiss guide who lives there in Washington, related to me once, it was the closest thing he could find in America to the Alps.
Mm-hmm. And I've talked to Martin about it before, and he absolutely loves this area. In fact, we had the honor of getting out together on a ski trip for 3 or 4 days in the North Cascades there. So we share the same love for the mountain range, I'm sure.
Let's get back to that glacier on Olympus, 1,000 feet deep or 1,000 feet thick in the 50s. How thick is it today?
You know, that's the one thing that's difficult about glaciers is you have all of these studies from various different years, and year to year you have what is a maritime snowpack year. And this maritime snowpack changes year to year. Basically, without snow, our glaciers retreat. And as it's warmed up, many of these glaciers have decreased in depth by a significant amount. And in Mount Olympus's case, from the pictures that I've seen, and this is hazarding a guess, I would say it's probably 300 feet less thick than it was. And you can see that from the moraine. There's a lot of moraine along the side. And in the old photos, that moraine was nearly level with the glacier itself. And now you have to climb down several hundred vertical feet before you get to the edge of the glacier. And in fact, in the late 1800s, some of the earliest photos of there, you can see where the glacier actually went another mile or two over these massive cliffs. In fact, one of the earliest reports I've ever found of, you know, Mount Olympus's glaciers was a hunter reporting that you would hear the crashes of ice thundering through the valleys from some 20 miles away. And there are reports of that with other glaciers in the Cascades and also in the Olympics there. In the case of the Anderson Glacier, where some of the earliest explorers went through and the earliest natives used as a path through the range as well. They would hear the same thing. And you just imagine that. You know, I heard something similar many years ago, and it was one of the giants, the massive trees that are back there, and really one of the few remaining natural forests we have in the country that are at sea level there. And it was one of these trees falling, and you could hear it. And I have no idea how far it was away, but just the thunder of that thing hitting was pretty spectacular to hear in a windless day in the middle of the forest.
Tell us about your glacier project. You're on course. You've skied, half of the remaining glaciers in the North Cascades? Or is it the Cascades? How are we?
I'm doing all the glaciers in the Olympics and Cascades, and this includes unofficially named as well as recently extinct but named glaciers. And so, you know, as far as skiing just the officially named glaciers, I saw that as kind of an easy way out, because my ultimate goal in visiting all the glaciers was, you know, we have these places with all of this snow, and the most snow is generally where these glaciers are. And I found myself at a period in my life there where I was like, God, have I done everything in the Cascades? I still wanted to go to different places. And what I eventually found that the Glacier project was allowing me to do is go to the backside of these peaks, to these places that nobody would go to because it's ridiculous to do it. Why would you spend, it can literally be a day or two to the summit of this peak, but if suddenly you have to go to the backside of it, it can become a week. And it was that adventure that I was seeking. Over time, it's obviously grown into other things, but initially, it was that adventure I was seeking out, a way to tie all my adventures together in the Cascades into kind of one cohesive story.
It sounds like a huge story.
There are 300 approximately glaciers that I have on my list. And of that, I have around 40 left.
How many of those are named?
Those are all named. It's part of my glacier project. For the last several years, I've spent an absurd amount of time reading through tens of thousands of pages of material, searching out some of the earliest reports of our glaciers, going back to the mid to late 1800s on into the early 1930s and the mountaineers and so forth, and learning the stories of these places. And, I remember reading this quote, and I wish I had it on hand, but essentially it said something along the lines, without a name, a place doesn't have, basically any meaning for us. And so what I wanted to do was slightly different, is I wanted to put a story to these places that had names so people understood what they were, because, a lot of these glaciers are disappearing. The first glacier I ever visited, I was just over 2 years old, and it was the Lower Paradise Glacier in Mount Rainier National Park, where, I had a couple of really famous things, and one of them were the Paradise Ice Caves. And the Paradise Ice Caves, the year I was 2 years after I was born, basically the year I was there, were measured as the longest known ice caves at the time in the world. And you had some 8 or 9 miles of caves within the Lower Paradise Glacier there. And I, learned to ski in that area, and we would watch it deteriorate year after year after year until the mid 1990s, it disappeared entirely.
So, this is immensely personal for you, because it's not just a pursuit, you have a relationship with these places and these glaciers. It's got to be heartbreaking. I think we all struggle with some of the effects of climate change. How do you cope with that? Is this a saying goodbye trip, or how do you process that? How do you feel about it?
Well, I always hate to take that kind of negative approach to it, because I feel like as places change, your experiences with them, while they may change, they're still grand experiences. I'm going to the Blue Glacier and having some of the best adventures I've ever had in my life, even though, it's fractionally smaller than it used to be. So has that adventure meant less to me? I would say no. Now, if the glaciers had ultimately entirely disappeared, it would definitely change that experience for me and for people in the future, but they would still have these incredible adventures to these very special places. One of the early botanists and naturalists of Mount Rainier was a guy named Flett, and the glacier that was given his name, is almost gone now. But beneath that glacier are these brand, new and vibrant flowers and growth that I'm sure he would be as equally fascinated with as he was the glaciers.
Let's throw it back a little bit. I want to know about your youth and how you got turned on to skiing and the outdoors.
So skiing for me was really something I grew up with, at a very early age there. My dad went to the B&I, which was a store down, I think, in Centralia. In fact, they had Ivan the gorilla there. Imagine going to a store and it had a gorilla in it, which is obviously not a very cool thing. And I've never been a fan of zoos. And I wasn't a fan even as a kid, but still, right next to this was a small store. And in this store, they were selling used skis and boots and so forth. So my dad bought 5 pair for my brothers, my mom, and himself, and all of us for some $20. And that included boots and poles. And probably knowing my dad the next day, we were up on the mountain learning to ski. And so I learned to backcountry ski before I ever went to a ski area. I was, I had taken a few rides on the lift prior to 10 years old, but really prior to 10 or 12, I learned all in the backcountry, meaning on glaciers.
And where would you go? Like, where would your family go?
Our initial time was spent on Mount Rainier. And so we would climb up to base camp on Mount Rainier to Camp Muir. In the spring, we'd go climb and ski off the summits of the volcanoes. We tried to, when I was 6 years old, to become, and I say we because my identical twin brother and I at the time tried to get the world record for the youngest to climb Mount Rainier, which was 7 years old at that time. And at 6 years old, that year, I think we went to Camp Muir some 30 times, which is about a 5,000 foot climb out of Paradise there. And my dad had old school gear, meaning we had crampons that he drew a picture of for a metalsmith, the guy made out of solid steel. We're not talking lightweight by any means. He had an old rope that was from his first climbs as a young man, and a wooden ice axe. And, I was a very, very small kid and towing behind a massive rope across these glaciers was just too hard for us. Especially in a 2-day period of time, which is when all of the adults do. And so we didn't quite make it. We probably 1,000 or 1,500 feet shy of the summit. And it wasn't till a handful of later years that we went back and climbed to the summit. But yeah, I had a very intimate relationship with Mount Rainier and always have.
Were there other families that were this ambitious, or were you guys unique in that?
Very unique, yeah. I mean, skiing and ski mountaineering was not a popular thing back then. When we go up onto the mountains, we'd be, one of a few skiers that were up there at all, if not the only ones. When you climb what today would see hundreds of skiers, almost any given day used to have no skiers and, a handful of climbers. And that's switched now to where you see more skiers than walkers. So it's just a very different experience now in the mountains. And we've seen ski mountaineering just explode here in Washington in a really big way. I mean, most people still stay close in to the passes and highways and so forth. And unfortunately, most of our range is, south of, let's say, White Pass. And we were talking about my Washington Traverse earlier. That for almost 120 miles into winter has no roads that enter it at all. So you have 120 miles that's now just wilderness, occasional snowmobile will go through there on forest roads or something like that. And we just don't have a lot of access points here in Washington. And so people are kind of limited to these select areas.
Which opens up the rest of the place to folks like yourself.
Well, yeah, exactly. It still frustrates me at times, to be honest. I wish there were easier places I could go ski. But, again, I'm really happy that I do have these places that I can go get lost in. Basically, as I've said in the past, from Seattle, you can look into the Olympics, for instance, and from your doorstep where 1 million people are looking out, they can see places that nobody has ever walked. And I think that's pretty special.
Absolutely. So this ascendancy of ski mountaineering and backcountry skiing that's supplanted a lot of the climbing as far as popularity goes. I'm sure the numbers are still.
Well, it's grown in almost every sense, but I would say in the winter, there are more people who travel through. It reminds me of why my dad started skiing. He was one of those walkers going up Mount Rainier and he saw some skiers go by. And he just was like, wow, that looks like fun. Whereas walking down a mountain, I'm not saying it's bad. I like doing it, but it's not as fun as skiing. So
having grown up there and having this family connection to these places, does it feel territorial at all to you? I mean, do you wish there were fewer skiers and more access points?
In the last few years, I've seen that change. I mean, me personally, the places I go aren't seeing any more people than they ever have. You know, if you get outside 3 or 4 hours of any trailhead, you're going to lose the people. But that's a long time if you're only going for a day trip. I will say where the frustration comes from is in the winter when it's snowing an absurd amount and our slopes become, more our avid danger generally lasts. And this is just a rule of thumb, but it's, not an end all. 24 hours within a storm, usually 90% of our avid danger is gone. And a lot of times I spend that time at a ski area. And now our ski areas have been purchased by large companies. And at least so far, they've just exploded in the amount of people that are coming to them. And, our parking areas are closing. It can take hours to get to the ski area when you used to just be able to drive up there. It was cheap to go on a daily, I'd say Crystal Mountain, for instance, used to be able to go up there for about $70, $80 a day about, I would say 5 years ago. And today it's $200. And on a weekend, you're spending $50 to park. And that's just one example, and it's across the board. And so as far as skiing, that has really changed the dynamic for families, and I think that's a big push of why people are going into the backcountry more, is because of growing costs and that kind of stuff and outdoor activities in general.
When you talk about the expense of going to these ski areas that are owned by the Vails of the world, and how much money they're getting when they're using our federal lands, right? In many cases. Is that not true?
Yeah, in a lot of cases here in Washington, and I'm not essentially against that. I guess, what do you do when the place is so busy? I don't know what the right answer is. It's almost like it's so busy that you almost need a lottery in order to go up there.
Right.
There is no right answer, unfortunately.
The follow-up question to that and the thought in my mind was Carl Skoog. And I know the Skoog family has a great deal of notoriety and impact in your area for the pioneering they did. And they're a little older than you and I. But one of Carl's causes was this fee for usage thing, or he was fighting against it. And it just got me thinking about that whole dynamic and what he would be thinking about some of these changes in his range.
Yeah, I mean, the fee for people to get outdoors, that's a hard one to swallow sometimes because, it's more the rules and these roadblocks that you have against these places. But again, it's hard to have an answer. I remember one trailhead I used to go to a lot as a kid. I maybe seen that parking lot full once in my life, and maybe a few cars pulled along the side. I went there a couple of years ago, and the parking lot, for instance, could maybe fit 40 cars, if you packed it all full and made it kind of ridiculous. Last time I went there were cars parked on both sides of the road, almost 2 miles past the trailhead. So that's the kind of explosion that you're seeing in our mountains. And you're not just seeing more people, you're seeing more pets even. I mean, you're seeing out of those 200 people, you're seeing another 100 dogs. And that was not common. And so that kind of wear and tear on the range it's hard to see, I know people need places to go. But again, it got really popular in the mountains in the 70s too. I don't know if it was to this extent. We'll go through a popularity now and maybe it'll retreat another couple of years. We just have a lot of young people coming here to work for Amazon and so forth too. And our population's gone from, 3 million, let's say 30 or 40 years ago to probably almost 7 million now. So that's a big change.
Yeah. Who knows what the future is going to be like, post COVID. I think this winter is going to be pretty telling. So where I'm most familiar with your work is through your photography, and you've been contributing to Alpinist and Backcountry for years. How did you get into that? How did you get into shooting, and why?
It's kind of something I fell into, which is quite different than most people. As a kid, I always imagined myself finding a way to live life into the mountains. But ultimately, I ended up going to college, following the path of getting a degree and working a full-time job, a 9 to 5. And I worked as a financial advisor. And, invested stocks and mutual funds and bonds and so forth. And in 2009, ended up leaving my job and taking a year off. And I kind of knew deep down it was almost walking away from my career. And I didn't know if I could have that desire or energy to want to go back. My best friend, Ben Manfredi, who I climbed with, and my twin brother had climbed with, and he passed away in a whitewater kayaking accident in 2003. And I ended up taking up his camera at the time. His family gifted that to me, and I started taking more and more photos. And then I just started to share my adventures. And in 2009, after I'd quit my job, I actually made a little bit of an income. It's a fraction of what I had obviously made as an advisor, but it was enough to get by. I was still young, and I thought, well, maybe I could give a go at this. And so I never stopped. I kept going out there. I kept telling stories of my own personal adventures, doing photography in a very different way than most people do by, hitching their wagon to one professional athlete or another. I just continued to go out and take photos on my own personal adventures. And, photography has changed over the years, and every year I make money in a very different way. But yeah, it was a good change. As one person, I remember reading this quote, and it said every 10 years you should change your career. And I've kind of tried to keep that to heart. I'd worked 10 years as a financial advisor, and, the next 10 years I worked as a photographer, and now I'm getting more into the history side of things. And I kind of think of it as my third step, because really after 10 years, you've learned everything you could in any job that you work. And if you're changing, you're still like, things are new for you. It's why you have so much memory from being a kid and going to, kindergarten through fifth grade or whatever it may be. And you can almost remember every separate day. But when you work the same job, sit in front of the computer, and nothing changes and nothing's new, time suddenly goes by really, really fast.
So you start out as a financial advisor, and then you move into photography. You're making a fraction of what you made before. And now you're transitioning into being a historian. And I can only imagine that. Is that not a fraction of what you make in photography?
Oh, I don't make money. I don't make money at it. I still have to do, tourism photography and other things that are very different than what I used to do. I don't know what will be next. Will I stay a photographer the rest of my life? Will I go back to being a financial advisor? You just never know. I don't know. I don't think I had the guts to go become a doctor or, a biologist or something absurd like that. Although I think it'd be very satisfying if I did.
Well, life is long. Let's talk about the immediate, the winter ahead of us. What are some of your plans in the Cascades in the Olympics this winter?
Boy, I always have a long list of plans. Some of the things I want to get done are obviously work on my Glacier project. Getting out into the North Cascades there and trying to piece together, some different ways of going through the mountains. And it's the same to be for the Olympics. There are a few old glaciers that I've found that aren't necessarily part of my list, but they're still places I want to go out to. So I might go traverse the national park one more time, a third time. Because I kind of love that range. It doesn't photograph very easy. It really should, but I don't know. It's kind of this spectacular little range that nobody really digs deep into. I mean, it's a very remote place. I mean, some of the earliest pioneers were the O'Neill expedition and the Press expedition in the mid 1880s, and most famously the Press expedition in 1890 that went out into that zone. And so, following through the footsteps of those pioneers was fascinating for me. But going back this third time is just kind of experiencing the mountains, through some of their paths again, but in a slightly different way.
When you say it doesn't photograph well, what do you mean? And how is that?
Well, it's a very wet and rainy, and, it's just a hard place. It's when what was it, Louis Dawson that said the Cascades were scrappy? I think the Olympics are even more scrappy in their own way. They're like this 4-foot midget that just wants to beat you out. It's a challenging little range. And I don't know why. I guess in the times that I've been in there, I've been so beat down trying to go so far every day that the last thing I want to do is try to get this amazing composition. I don't know what it is. You get these high glacier peaks of the North Cascades, and they're just easier to photograph. You have these scenes that are just easy to put together. Whereas in the Olympics, you have these scrappy little trees, these peaks that are maybe 6,000 or 7,000 feet tall, and they're just different. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe something like the East Coast would look like if they had slightly taller peaks that were a little more craggy.
So often in photography and in the ski world, a lot of the imagery is turkey shoot stuff, we call it, right? Where you're yo-yoing someplace, you're out for a day, and you're getting that glory shot. I've done a number of traverses myself, many, and I've always been struck by the photographers, because for as hard as we work as just regular ski tours, the photographers got to work, I think, twice as hard. They're circling the group like a border collie, and they're carrying twice the weight. And I've always been blown away by that. And it's just the motivation to get that image beyond the turkey shooting and getting deep into these ranges on these multi-day tours is awesome. How do you characterize that? Like, that takes a tremendous amount of drive.
Yeah. And it has its price, really. As I get older, carrying those heavy packs and so forth has really beat up my body. But, at the same time, I love to tell that story, and trying to get that story in the mountains is a big part of why I'm going out there. On the weight sensitive scale, like, you're looking at about 20 extra pounds is generally what I carry, more than the nearest person. And to put that into scale for people who necessarily don't carry packs, I generally carry about 2 pounds of food a day. So you could think of it in another way as being 10 days of food. And then you have skis, boots, harnesses, ropes, and all of the extra gear that you need. And it becomes rather absurd. Anywhere from 65 to as much as, I was younger and didn't have the nicest gear, as much as 100 pounds on my back.
And how are your knees?
Yeah, they've been better. I was a telemark skier starting out.
I was just going to ask that. Are you still tellying? That was the question. I was leading up to that.
I occasionally still telly, but a few years ago, I realized that I needed something new. And I've been telemark skiing my whole life, every single day. I've learned that way in the mountains. And the last few years, I just wanted to try something different. And so I put on some downhill skis for the last few years. And the only way I could do it was literally to just not tele ski that much, because I would just fall back into the habit of doing what I always have done. And so I thought it would be easier on my knees, but it turned out to be harder on my feet. So I don't know which is the better tool, but I will say that it was another way to lighten my pack. A telemark setup with the boots are 10 pounds. The bindings are much, much heavier. You're looking at a 20-pound setup, and you can, easily take it down to 13 or 15 pounds. And so it was another way to just knock some weight off the pack. And
that's another 2 days of food right there.
Yeah. And it's just easier. I won't lie, like going through the mountains on a pair of lightweight, like downhill skis, it's just much easier. Now I'd say it's not as enjoyable, but I still like telly, and I feel like I should go back, but my kneecap has torn itself into 2 pieces, and that's not going to heal over time. Although I have no pain in my knees, it's still something I look at every once in a while, like, is that going to fully come apart or not?
You can always telly midweek at Crystal.
Yeah, and some groomers.
Yeah, it is fascinating to see what you guys have done and the Skoogs have done before all of this really fly AT gear existed, and the distance you guys were covering you guys are just superhuman. I can't even put it together. I mean, we're starting to see stuff happening in other ranges. I'm thinking particularly in Colorado, where people are doing these radical link ups that really were never even thought about before. Maybe they have a lot of flat tracking or whatever, but it's all made possible by this light gear. But you guys were doing it on the heavy stuff.
Yeah, it was very different because, I used to have to print out maps, and I would, plot out routes over time, and put a little X every like quarter inch or so and try to work, out these routes over sometimes years. And nowadays people have GPX or KML tracks, and they're able to look on Google Earth, and it's really changed the experience. I remember when I first got a GPS, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and I actually left it at home on one trip. I left all my maps behind and just went out for 7 days, did like 100 and something miles, and had a hell of an experience of just finding my way through the mountains. And I've done that on other trips as well. I did a link up of, and this was on foot, of the Ptarmigan Traverse, which is one of our most popular traverses here as far as ski traverses go. And linked that together with kayaking the Seattle River, and then road biking and mountain biking all the way back, and did some 130 miles with 3 good nights of sleep and like 72 hours. And so it was also another cool way to just see the mountains.
Unreal. What do you typically do when you're putting a trip together these days? Obviously, we know the old way. Like you say, you got GPS, you got Google Earth, you've got all of these pretty fantastic and robust apps for your phone now. What are you finding yourself using today?
So the way I go about figuring out a route is I'll plot it out on Google Earth first. And then from Google Earth, I'll put it onto my maps. And then on my maps, that'll sort of change depending on where I see the topo lines and where the flattest spot is and the easiest way down. And then track it that way. And then because a lot of these places don't have trails or very easy exits, meaning an exit could, in the Olympics, for instance, you could be 30, 40 miles out because the roads are closed as well. Even though it's 20 miles to the road, all of a sudden, what are you going to do at the end of the road? I remember on one trip, I was out for 16 days. I got to the end of the trail, which was completely washed out for almost 7 or 8 miles or 10 miles or more, actually. And then I hit a road and that was washed out, hiked that another 10 miles, got to a gate, and then there was nobody there. So I basically hiked from the summit of Glacier Peak nearly to the town of Darrington. So when I'm in the mountains and I'm plotting these maps, another thing that I'll do is plot A, B, and C routes. And so when I'm in the mountains, I can quickly, in a storm or in whatever conditions I'm in, be able to look at these routes that I've plotted alternates. Because a lot of times you'll get to that spot and it's a cliff, or it's not as easy as you had thought it was going to be. And so I can go, well, we can go left or we can go right, and know those answers right away because, on top of doing all the photography and much of the route finding, I have to kind of be on top of it. As a young kid, that was not my nature. In fact, I remember my friend Ben, who I mentioned earlier, the guy who had passed away and I got the camera from and started photography with, I remember him telling me, Hummel, if you were in the mountains by yourself, you would never get anywhere. And for a couple of years, he was absolutely right. It took me quite some time to learn because he was brilliant when it came to route travel and plotting routes through the mountains. And so it took some time in my early 20s to kind of figure out my own way of getting through the mountains. And yeah, it's been an awesome experience. I love learning. So I think learning is the most fascinating part.
Right. Yeah. And you piece together the science, the natural world, the history, and the skiing and the photography. I mean, you got a lot going on there. It's pretty remarkable. How much time does it take to put together a 6-day traverse, advanced time? Like how many hours does it take for you to put a project together like that?
I mean, I can definitely spend a few days. Sometimes I put in less because I don't necessarily want to know the answers, and I know somebody else has already figured it out. When I have to spend more time on something is when I don't know of anybody else who's done it. And so then I have to like really figure it out, because while I may not have as much of a schedule, perhaps the people I have with me do. And so I have to be able to get these people out the other side. And that's the same. It's not just for traverses. I mean, traverses are something I do, 5 or 10 times a year, but like I go out and do peaks and other things as well that take their own little complications to figure out too. But it definitely takes an investment of time of at least a few days, but those few days are an hour here, an hour there over, the course of much time. And that's only because of the experience that I have from knowing the nature of these places by having been there before. If I were to go to some other range in some other part of the world, my experience would translate somewhat, but not nearly in the same way that it would here.
I did the Haute route unguided with Gordy Skoog in probably, 2009 maybe. And he's a remarkable guy in the mountains, just like his brothers. But he came with that kind of Cascade mentality, and I don't remember the particulars of it. I just remember being in awe of this guy, because he was naturally out front, picking the routes. We had photocopied maps. It was a bit of a junk show, I'm not going to lie, but it was just incredible to watch this guy put it together. He had far more knowledge than any of the rest of us. And I remember him remarking on how different the mountains were, and just no trees, just totally different.
Yeah, I mean, the mountains in different parts of the world that I've been to are vastly different, and again, that's why the Cascades are so special, is that we have so much packed into such a small area.
You are an ambassador for the Winter Wildlands Alliance. And that's a project that's near and dear to us here. We work with them all the time and believe very strongly in their mission. And it's no surprise that you're, to me, knowing who you are and what you do, that you're an ambassador. How did you get turned on to their organization, and what do you do as an ambassador?
So I was actually contacted by Powder Magazine back in the day, and David, who was a part of Winter Wildlands Alliance, came out to the Cascades, and we went on a little micro adventure together. And some years later, when he had moved towards working for that organization, he reached out to me. And
this is David
one of the
Page.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to, as part of being in the mountains, it can oftentimes be kind of a selfish thing. And it's hard to figure out ways to give back, in the ways that I've done so is by teaching or giving my advice to probably thousands of people on how to get into the mountains, how to take photographs and other things like that. And also donating photographs to various organizations, a lot of times in a scale that's more than I actually made for the year, in what it raised for these different organizations. But it never been kind of the voice. And so I kind of wanted to see what these people were saying and how they operated a business like this, and ultimately what their goals were. I love how we have these vast empty spaces to explore, and that are still really as they always have been. But I think there's always spaces for other people too, in whatever sport they may do. Is that, I'm of the idea that unless you use something and people are experiencing it, then it means something to these people. And if it doesn't, and it's just an empty place and nobody's out there, then they can quickly disappear. So there's a fine balance. And I think it's important to keep that in mind too. But yeah, I'm selfishly in love with the big open spaces for sure. But in some sense, I wish they'd build another ski area in Washington, because there are a few places they could, just to spread people out a little bit more. But that, will never happen here.
So Jason, do you think of your photography in these open spaces as potentially part of the history of these places for the next generation? Is that part of your drive with all this shooting you do?
When I look at these old photographs and some of the earliest ones I can find of the Cascades of the late 1800s, or even some of the earliest drawings that I can find from Lieutenant Baker, for instance, who is for whom Mount Baker is named for. His drawing too, you do get to see how these people saw the world and saw these mountains. And, I feel definitely that my photography, I would hope, shows these places and experiences as we had them today. As the glaciers change and evolve, I'm sure it'd be interesting for people to go back and look at how people were able to ski these mountains. I mean, there are certainly routes I've skied that are impossible or much more difficult today than they were 20 years ago. And, when I look at some of the old photographs from 100 years ago and see these glaciers, and especially on the volcanoes, which are photographed more, and you're like, whoa, that's pretty wild to see the mountain look like that. Imagine if you did an art piece, for instance, where you're able to see all these peaks with no glaciers on them. It'd be very interesting to see. But, the more I get into the history, for me personally, it just enriches that experience in the mountains, as I mentioned earlier. And I could definitely go on and tell some stories if you want.
I do want. Give me what's the story at the top of your mind, and how did you intersect with it in the mountains?
Well, you mentioned intersecting, and that's one thing I like to see is how different people in different places intersect with, either historical characters or miners and so forth. One interesting story kind of started out with Mount St. Helens, of all places. And there's a glacier on there called the Leschi Glacier. And I asked myself the question of, how did this glacier get this name? Because Leschi, Chief Leschi in particular, in the 1850s was hung. So how did he tie into this glacier that's nowhere near where he was? I mean, he lived up in a totally different region. And how did that name transfer? And it took me a very long time and a lot of research and different articles to kind of figure out this story. But more importantly, how all these people came together. In our history here in the Cascades, Mount Rainier ties into that story because August Valentine Kautz was working at Stellicum. And Fort Stellicum's the earliest city we ever had here in Washington. And in 1853, when he arrived in Washington State, it was actually Washington Territory at the time. And the first territorial governor of Washington was Isaac Stevens. And another character we have in this, besides Kautz and besides Leschi, was Ptolemy. And Ptolemy came to Mount Rainier in 1833. And he was at Fort Stellicum there. And Kautz was very interested in getting up Mount Rainier. But again, how do we have more of these connections? Well, it turns out August Valentine Kautz married a native woman, and that native woman was Kittietta, was her anglicized name. And she ended up marrying August Valentine Kautz. But she was, Leschi's brother's daughter. And so they had 2 kids together. Ptolemy was the first guy to go, that we know of that went to Mount Rainier in 1833. And then later on, Ptolemy gives advice to Kautz, and Kautz tries to attempt to summit Rainier. He gets within a couple hundred feet. To make this story much, much shorter, is Kautz ended up being the guy who brought Chief Leschi to Fort Stellicum to get hung because, really it came down to a battle with Isaac Stevens, the first territorial governor. And it's a long story, but ultimately with his pressure, they ended up hanging Leschi. And even the guy who hung Leschi later wrote that he hung an innocent man. But Kautz tried for a couple of years to get Leschi off. And he almost ultimately ended up doing so. But in commemoration, Kittietta, who was married to Kautz, who was, I guess, related to Leschi. The brother ended up taking on the name of Leschi, George Leschi in particular. And he went in 1890 with a guy named Fred Gordon Plummer, who mapped Mount Rainier and one of the earliest people to map it. He went to Mount St. Helens and climbed it. And in 1967, there were no officially named glaciers on Mount St. Helens. And so they commemorated that, what they thought was a glacier he climbed to him. And so that's kind of a very short and brief tale of what is a much, much longer tale of how one glacier got its name.
Fascinating. Do you know what tribe they were from?
Well, it's kind of complicated. You had the Mashal and the Nisqually. But it really was a name that generally the white man put towards different people, depending on the river they lived next to. And there was a lot of different families. You have to remember how the natives at the time, let's say a simple example is the Lower Columbia tribe. They had disease come through there in the late 1700s, and it killed some 30% of the tribe. In the early 1800s, you had another disease came there, and the captain of the ship held up a vial in the air. And he said, if you don't bring me your best furs, I'm going to leave disease here. And he happened to, as far as a few historians have been able to determine, left malaria. And that killed some 70 to 90% more of the natives that lived there. And those are just two ways of the diseases that happened. And so you had a very fractured people. Ultimately, by the time whites had come here and really started to spread out, there weren't many left. I'd hate to say it, but it was almost an empty land. And so it was very easy for Isaac Stevens, in this case, to sweep up all the natives and put them onto reservations. And there was a few small battles here and there, but we never had any major battles here. And Stevens, believe it or not, how it links into the story even more is Isaac Stevens' son, Hazard Stevens, was the first person to climb Mount Rainier in 1870. And he perpetuated a story of natives being afraid of the mountain. And he was a proponent for natives, believe it or not, in a slight way. I mean, it's hard to get into the minutiae of it, but that story was perpetuated over time. But natives had long been going into the mountains and climbing them, going back to the earliest stories, back to the middle of the 1800s, natives going into the Olympics and climbing mountains in there, to Mount Baker, to Mount Rainier. In 1857, Couts bought a native who tried to go to the summit with him, but ended up getting snowblind. And through efforts of all members of the party, they were ultimately able to get him back out. And none of them were ever fully healthy again from that experience of trying to go up into the mountain, including the native who was not a young fellow at the time either.
Wow. I'm reading history of the Lewis and Clark expedition right now, and we are currently on the Columbia River, and I'm forgetting the native tribe that they wintered with. There's a fort they had named after them. But so it's pretty cool to have this conversation, hear some of those stories, because it's just wild.
Yeah, I mean, history is a fascinating thing. That the more you get into it, you start to link together these things. But it is history is written through the white man's eye too, and so it's really hard to kind of tie in stories that I would love to tell. As far as the natives come, there's a few links to their stories, and Audrey Haynes around Mount Rainier was a historian, and he ended up jotting down some very interesting stories. And one of them was of a miner or a hunter, I forget which, who was coming up through the mountains. And he actually met a native who had a very similar, almost the same name as the native who took up Stevens and onto Mount Rainier in 1870. And so people discarded the story. But understanding the way the natives look at the world and how they would often take on the same names for being in a region, or the way they perhaps drew maps were very different, because the map may have a larger space, I've read, for one area, but that's because they wanted you to spend more time in that area. And so it took up more room in the map. So it was a different way of looking at the world. But anyway, that miner ended up meeting a couple of Nisquallies, and they ended up going up onto Mount Rainier and nearly climbing to the summit just as a whim. They didn't know anybody had ever been on the mountain before. So it shows the natives probably quite often went on to the mountain. I mean, they knew that there was what they call the Lake of Fire up there. And, you know, the summit of Rainier has what is called the highest lake in the state, if you consider it a lake, because it's melted and it's in the steam caves of Rainier. And so it's not technically a lake, but there's still water up there and steam that comes out of it, and a pretty major series of caves down there.
Well, Jason, really appreciate you sharing this history, sharing your experiences, and I know you'll do it for years to come. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me. Excited to get out there and ski, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Backcountry Podcast and for supporting independent media. And one more shout out to our friends at Taos Ski Valley for sponsoring this episode. Here's a quick word from Taos.
Support comes from Taos Ski Valley, committed to protecting people, place, and planet so that its ecosystem and spirit can be preserved for generations to come. Learn more at skitaos.com.
The Backcountry Podcast is produced by Backcountry Magazine, an imprint of Height of Land Publications in Jeffersonville, Vermont. Backcountry's small but mighty staff works hard to bring you stories that are beautifully produced, thoughtfully edited, and thoroughly fact-checked. Betsy Monero is our editor-in-chief. Mike Horn is our podcast producer and engineer. Our music was composed by Alex Paul. Please consider supporting independent journalism by subscribing at backcountrymagazine.com. Use code PODCAST for 10% off your entire order. I'm Adam Howard. Thanks for listening. Until next time, we'll see you in the backcountry.